Hello everyone, welcome back to another paint and chat video. Today I'm going to be working on these landscape paintings, which is what you can see me taping up my sketchbook here for. I'm just taping it down to minimize the warping in this sketchbook and also to give the landscapes some nice borders, so that's kind of what's going on in this footage here. And today I'm going to be talking about a question I get asked a lot, and that is kind of a two-parter. It's, is doing art my main job, and also how is it different going from art just being a hobby to art as a job? What are the differences? Is it becoming a chore? Is making art less fun? All of that kind of stuff. So I'm just gonna dive into that because this landscape painting is pretty self-explanatory. I'm just sketching it out roughly here, and then you will see me gradually progress with the illustration process, the watercolor painting part, and also the inking. But back to the main topic of the video. I just wanted to start off by kind of explaining my situation, because I know it's very different and untraditional compared to how most people might end up translating, like going from art being a hobby to a job. Because for me, there wasn't really a moment where it kind of switched. It was a very natural progression, which I'm sure for most people that's not the case. And I think I've kind of explained my situation before, but I'll just go over it again because it's obviously very relevant to this video. But I've been basically working at kind of the Studio of MM, branding or idea, whatever you kind of see this as, because my whole reason for starting Studio of MM was that it was kind of a collective group, possibly, of any of my creative thoughts, plans, ideas, whether it at some point translated into more than one person kind of working under me. It was just it started off as creating this like broad idea that I could have a name for and everything could go under that. And I have been working at kind of the Studio of MM idea since I was 14. So starting off doing this so young, I've just never kind of known anything else. Art has always been more of a job than a hobby to me, I guess you could say. It has obviously evolved over the years, but I have been posting art online and kind of, making money off of it for years at this point. And it's just kind of been this random, lucky, natural progression that has ended up to where I am now, where right now, obviously, YouTube is a big part of the kind of Studio of MM brand or creative venture. I started mainly kind of what started gaining traction was I made all of these kind of crazy Legend of Zelda paper crafts, which ended up getting picked up by like Kotaku and a bunch of really big websites, which eventually then ended up having my artwork featured in a video game art book, and then at some point that kind of translated into more traditional art because all of a sudden I had this, decently sized audience that kind of cared about my artwork and what I was creating. And so I kind of left the paper craft part behind and started exploring more with traditional art, although I'm sure you can tell at different points, the paper artwork I've just kind of evolved over time. I still really enjoy doing these kind of crazy artworks that are completely paper. Now the big one are the paper light boxes, and that's kind of why I also haven't really stuck to a style. I kind of just jump around wherever I kind of feel like that week or whatever I feel like creating, and the whole papercraft idea is probably why, because that transition was not easy. I basically don't make any 3D paper crafts anymore. Definitely not like I did. I was making life-size models of people and like these crazy things constantly. And, I just don't do that anymore. It's translated into more traditional artwork mainly now, especially with YouTube. You know, traditional artwork is definitely kind of the way to go when you're making YouTube videos, although I do obviously still enjoy, like I said, doing the kind of mixed media and paper craft things. But obviously at some point when I was kind of starting posting more traditional artwork is when I started selling prints and other like t-shirts and all of that kind of stuff with my designs on it through Redbubble and at one point Society6, although Redbubble is where I'm at now. I'm still using it. And you know, that's kind of where kind of the business part started coming in. You know, it doesn't cost you anything to put your artwork online and on these different websites to be able to sell it on merchandise and prints and all of that kind of stuff. And that's just kind of where I started, is just gradually translating over into various things. And then obviously at some point when I was started doing more traditional artwork, I started making YouTube videos, which I pretty sure I explained this fairly recently, how I kind of accidentally became a YouTube artist, and that was because I started posting videos for my craft website, because video tutorials were sometimes easier to make and be useful than written tutorials. And then all of a sudden I realized I had like thousands of subscribers because people were interested in seeing these videos where I was explaining how to make these different crafts and stuff. And so I just kind of worked with it, and obviously over time it's translated definitely into more heavily traditional artwork, you know, definitely watercolor, and just, you know, talking about art supplies and just, you know, being passionate about traditional art media. And now, because I've obviously worked up a decent, somewhat, I guess you could call it, portfolio, or, you know, people are just more aware of my work and what I can do. I now do more commissions from time to time, and, you know, people hire me to do different design work and stuff. And so that's kind of where I'm at now. I'm enjoying making these YouTube videos. You guys seem to be enjoying them as well. So that's a big focus. I also take on different side jobs, and obviously I'm now running my own web store, as well as still continuing with the Redbubble merchandise and all of that kind of stuff. And so, like I said, yeah, like for me, it's just been a very natural progression. And obviously when I was a kid, you know, drawing and stuff was a hobby, but anything that I can remember now, it's just kind of been the same. So I guess the answer simply for the question of, you know, is doing art as a job less fun than doing it as a hobby? And no, it's just different. You know, if I was doing art as a hobby, I wouldn't necessarily be making art for other people. You know, I would be solely making art for myself, whatever I wanted to do all of the time, 24/7, well, not 24/7 if it's a hobby, but, you know, you just wouldn't be taking on these different projects that you will obviously be doing somewhat when you have this as a job. You know, you have to kind of balance it out with figuring out ways to make money off of the artwork that you want to do, which luckily, for the most part, I have, I guess, succeeded at. You know, for YouTube, I essentially get to do almost any kind of artwork that I want, as long as, you know, obviously there's structure. You know, these painting videos, I want to make sure are, you know, a certain type of artwork or whatever that would work for a video. But other than that, essentially I get to create whatever I want. When you're doing commissions, you are definitely creating artwork that sometimes you won't be that interested in. Obviously, if you're kind of doing more freelance style things, you can say yes or no to different projects, but ultimately, most of the time, I would say you will be creating artwork that normally you would not necessarily be doing on your own, which isn't a bad thing, because I know different commissions that I have taken on have kind of forced me into doing things that I would not normally do, and ultimately it's become more beneficial to me as an artist. But on the other side of that, there have definitely been times where I've kind of pushed myself too much and have completely basically burnt out. You know, I've talked about that in a whole video before, about kind of artist burnout and kind of my thoughts on it, I guess you could say. And so definitely that is one of, I guess, the downsides to having art as a job versus a hobby is I can't see you necessarily running into burnout when it's a hobby, because obviously if you're not feeling like doing artwork, you're not going to force yourself into working on it when it's, not your job. And I guess my main point, if you are looking at transitioning from art being a hobby to a job, make sure you still, at the end of the day, have a hobby. Because that is something that I've kind of gradually been working on over the last few years, and I think it's been balancing things out a lot better than, when you're constantly working on artwork 24/7, because obviously that is your job, and no one should be working at their job constantly. But, I totally get that, art is your first passion. If you started off with it being a hobby, it's still probably going to be your main hobby. It's not like you're enjoying doing it less when it is all of a sudden your job. You just really need personal projects to kind of balance out everything else. And so for me personally, that has kind of been the costume building side of things, which a lot of people would say, it's still an art hobby. You could kind of section that down into, especially I'm normally building armor and like painting armor and all of that kind of stuff, which is still very art related, but building armor and costumes has absolutely basically nothing to do with any of the artwork that I'm making for my job, essentially. It's not a traditional piece of artwork done in like watercolor or whatever else. It's very different. And the other thing that I've kind of been working at, or I guess being interested in as more of a hobby, is 3D printing as well, which, is still a fairly creative avenue to go down for a hobby. So, if you're, like I said, if you're looking at translating, making the transition from hobby to job, just make sure that you still at the end of the day have a hobby. It's not a bad thing for it to still be extremely art related, but just make sure that there is a distinct line between your hobby and personal projects or work and your job work, because that is how you stay sane and how I think you will not feel the possible burnout and friction of having this thing that you love doing so much all of a sudden not be as fun. Just still keep it fun in other ways. And I think I've rambled on enough about that topic. Hopefully that was kind of helpful to some of you, and that I kind of got my point across, or my thoughts across okay on that topic. And I guess I should probably actually talk about the artwork that I've been working on this whole time. So these landscapes were inspired by Breath of the Wild. They were just watercolor paint, and then I was going over them, as you can see here, with the 0.25 millimeter Muji ballpoint pen, which, like I've mentioned before, I've been really obsessed with, but it's not waterproof, so that's kind of why I was doing the inking after. And so here, just removing the tape so you can see those nice clean lines, and yeah, that is the end of this video. Hopefully, like I mentioned, you found that topic and my thoughts helpful, or, just interesting at least, another viewpoint, maybe, having you think about things that maybe you hadn't thought of before. But yes, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video.